All right, great guys. Thanks. It's definitely awesome to be here and speak at HackSpaceCon. This content is really awesome. It's been an experience putting this together over the last few years, and I mean, thank you. Where's the money defeating ATM disk encryption. So first, my name is Matt Burch. I am a principal research consultant with Atreides Partners, and I've been in the InfoSec community for about 20 years. During the course of that, I've earned a few accolades and got the opportunity to participate in some interesting things within the financial sector. And from that, one of the passions that have really grown on me is I really enjoy taking a look at devices that are presumed to be impenetrable, right? Those devices always result in the most interesting attack scenarios and lead to very interesting paths, which is one of those experiences that I will actually be talking about today. So for this agenda, I plan to briefly introduce the ATM industry. And from there, I'll then introduce Diebold Nixdorf's proprietary Dynamic Security Suite software. We'll then dive a little bit deeper into the pre-boot authorization process provided by Dynamic Security, and then we'll wrap up with a little bit of cat and mouse vulnerability research style. So let's start off by taking a look at the industry. So the ATM market is essentially divided into two classes of systems, like most of the things that we see in the environment. There are consumer and financial grade platforms. Consumer grade platforms are the ones you see outside the gas station, in your grocery store. Usually they run Windows CE, and they lack a lot of the enterprise security controls that we typically see. In contrast to that, we have the financial class ATM solutions. These run full Windows embedded, 10, 11, and they have a full security stack, usually unique to each manufacturer. And in the financial realm, there's actually only 3 manufacturers of the hardware platforms, which are Hyosung, NCR, and then Diebold Nixdorf. Physically tearing apart the devices, they're essentially divided into 2 hemispheres. You have the top portion of the ATM, which is known as the top hat. This carries all the PC peripherals and components of the device, really the guts of the system that allow it to work. The bottom portion is the vault, and then that's where all the cash is. That's usually what they try to secure, and that's the major interest in the design of the ATM. These 2 compartments are physically isolated, but the physical security controls architecturally between those 2 vary drastically. So the bottom portion, inch-thick steel, heavy volt locking mechanisms, seismic, tamper detection mechanisms. But when you look at the top hat that carries all the components that allow the system to work, there are plastic components in the front of the ATM. It's very thin gauge steel. There's vent holes, easy paths for tool insertion. And the locking mechanism is actuated from a cable that's hooked up to the solenoid. You pull the cable, the top hat opens, and you have access to all the PC peripherals. And this brings into the attack vectors affecting the platforms. One of the things that they all share in common is there is a requirement for physical access. And some of those common attack vectors are black box devices, which are pretty common. These are usually placed outside the ATM with the goal of manipulating the communication between the ATM and the banking network. Card skimmers, those are pretty simple. We're all familiar with those. And then some of my favorite are the destructive physical attacks. These are the ones that really get news coverage when someone rams through a banking wall and tries to rip out the ATM, or they use explosives. What's interesting about these is they don't usually work very well in succession, right? It's 1-off, 2-off events. They're pretty public, and the goals are fairly obvious. But if we take a step back and actually look at the landscape of the ATMs, there are thousands of devices deployed across the continental United States, and each one of those systems hold a very large sum of cash. And despite the requirements for physical access, criminal activity against these platforms has seen exponential growth over just the last few years. But what's interesting about that is actually of no surprise if we take a deeper look into the logical infrastructure of the ATMs themselves. Specifically, the core functionality of the ATM depends on an API known as XFS, or Extension for Financial Services. This is an API that provides an abstraction layer between the software on the ATM and the ability to dispense funds out of the cash cassette. Typically, it's unauthenticated. You hook the DLL, you tell it to dispense funds, and the ATM goes ahead and dispenses funds. The software stack on the ATM is typically all executed in the context of local administrator. So if you get any level of code execution, it's very easy to manipulate the system. In addition to that, there are a number of management components within the ATM. There's an interface to control the operational state of the ATM. There's an interface to control the setup of the Windows operating system. And then each manufacturer has another abstraction layer. And usually in production deployments, these application stacks can all have default credentials. All of this comes together, and it actually makes these devices a very attractive target for organized crime. And I'd be remiss if I didn't briefly talk about the network, the way the ATMs work in general, that allows you to actually get money from your banking institution out of whatever ATM you use. The way that it works is that's essentially a private environment where access is garnered through a gatekeeper or hosting provider. Essentially, they install a piece of software on the ATM, and then that facilitates communication back to that infrastructure. What's unique is that software or access for the ATMs to get to that network is not, it requires a certification process. So the hosting provider usually certifies the software and the hardware platform where the connection is going to run and deem whether or not that's certified. This all brings us to Diebold Nixdorf and their proprietary Dynamic Security Suite software. Unlike other ATM security stacks, and each manufacturer has their own, Diebold actually has multi-vendor certification, allowing any ATM hardware manufacturer to run Diebold software and get access to the banking network, which is key. This has allowed them to reach far beyond their hardware footprint, where in 2015, they were assumed to represent about 35% of the ATM market. And in 2018 and 19, they partnered with two of the largest financial institutions representing the US gaming industry. So not only is Diebold represented in a lot of ATMs, it's also on almost every casino floor across the United States. Those cash out systems that print your receipt after you use a slot machine, those are likely running Diebold or Dynamic Security under the hood. So now that we understand kind of what the landscape is, let's look at Dynamic Security specifically. So like many of the ATM security stacks, there's a number of default security protections that Dynamic offers. There's tamper detection, firewall policies, and disk encryption, which is actually one of the most important parts of the security posture of the ATM. But what's unique about Dynamics is it's not really full disk encryption. So there's two unencrypted partitions. First is the EFI or UEFI partition. This is pretty common. Most corporate enterprise setups, this isn't encrypted. It contains the bootloader that allows the system to initialize and various setup scripts. What is unique is an unencrypted Linux partition, especially when you're looking at a Windows-based platform. So it's somewhat of a red herring in that architectural design. Taking a look at that Linux partition, it self-identifies itself as Super's chaff. And the details that are contained in SE version, any manufacturer can set it up to be whatever they want. It's not necessarily a clear indication of what that Linux operating system is, but it's a good starting point for online reconnaissance to figure something out. So online reconnaissance of Super Chaff actually resulted in a whole lot of nothing. But it led me to Worms Armageddon, right? Super cool game, 2D shooter. You launch sheep as mobile projectiles against your enemies. It's super fun. Has absolutely nothing to do with ATMs at all. But what was unique is the video I stumbled across was in German. And they were talking about sheep. And Super's Chaff, I'm enunciating that incorrectly, is actually German for super sheep, which also happened to be an install directory underneath the user partition that contains most of the system binaries, right? Okay. And online reconnaissance of Supersheep was significantly more rewarding. In 2016, a consulting firm known as SecConsult released a blog article detailing a number of code execution vulnerabilities in a piece of software known as Cryptware CryptoPro and their underlying Supersheep Linux operating system. There were a lot of similarities within this blog article and the operating system, the Linux partition on the ATM. But this is one point of reference, and I couldn't confirm whether or not these two environments were identical. So in order to try and associate or confirm the suspicion, I returned to Diebold's website, which they have a number of user license agreements. There are some SBOM details in there. And version 3.0 of Dynamic Security specifically identifies, yes, they are using Cryptware CryptoPro. What's interesting about this, though, is the references on Diebold's website to the third-party integration of Crypto or CryptoPro are sparse, whereas version 3.0 in this documentation was actually the first reference, and at the time, the only reference that they were using Crypto or CryptoPro. Now I think the latest version is 4.5, and I think they reintroduced a reference to Crypto or CryptoPro, but it is interesting that SBOM details don't contain all of the SBOM information. So who is Cryptware CryptoPro? It is a cryptographic spinoff. They were started in 2002. The goal of the organization was to enhance Microsoft's BitLocker and introduce an integrity validation process as part of the disk encryption strategy. Today, the organization is represented in numerous countries, and each individual representation of the organization has a completely different domain name, completely different marketing materials, completely different look and feel. The only thing that really links them back together is references to the physical addresses. And despite this somewhat suspicious online presence, they boast over 500,000 licenses. And they also self-proclaim that employees love their encryption model. All right, cool. Let's dive a little bit deeper into how this integrity validation process works. So taking the ATM, powering on the system, Dynamic Security actually has a very unique characteristic. From UEFI, it executes a dual boot process. First operating system that's launched is Linux or Supersheep. This boots up, does some black magic. If everything is completed successfully, the system shuts down, goes back to UEFI. Windows is then automatically launched, logs in as administrator, bootstraps the rest of the ATM software. ATM comes up, is fully operational. Okay, so the first attack path, obviously, right, is like, let's manipulate the contents in Linux. It's unencrypted, right? Straightforward. Unfortunately, not so much. If you modify the content on Linux, you're presented with this really awesome integrity error page. Says the system doesn't match its certification process. But if you modify other files on the system, there's a slightly different error page that's presented. And this one contains a bit more detail and identifies there's about 253 elements that are validated on the disk. All right, well, this is really cool because now I have an indication that there is a probable attack path because they're not checking everything, they're selectively checking specific files. So the goal is to figure out what is this index, how are things validated. Returning to the Linux partition, I ultimately stumble across a directory in the root called log, right? Fairly obvious. Inside the log directory, there are a number of some index files. These contain indexes across about 2,500 files, which is significantly larger than the 253 I was looking to specifically identify. But this is the only contextual reference that I was able to find. The problem is this still results in a pretty significant delta. So there's a little over 10,000 files on the Linux disk, minus the 2,500 files I know that they check. there's a probable attack surface of like 8,200 files. Although most of those are configuration scripts, maybe they're not interpreted, there's not much of a chance to manipulate the system. In these scenarios, I like to take a step back and look for a default common denominator, right? In this case, it happens to be background images. So the default dynamic security background image is located in a few different locations. Images are generally benign, and they're not validated during this integrity validation process. So randomly pick one, modify it, and reboot the system. Initially powers on, bummer. Get the default dynamic security logo. But shortly after that, I do get the modified background image. Cool. This is important because it identifies, yes, they're doing integrity validation, but it's also not infallible. So there is an attack surface and things are selectively validated. In addition to that, now that I have a modified background image, I can actually track the error screens and make a determination on the phase of how the integrity process is executed, which happens to be carried out across two phases. So phase one is executed from UEFI, the UEFI binaries via bootxsa or bootxsa2. This is where the 253 elements are actually validated on the disk. It's a pretty easy index file that can be extrapolated from those binary initialization scripts. The second phase is executed from Linux. Once root performs its auto logon out of root's profile script, the phase two integrity process is initialized. That's where the 2,500 files are scanned, and then that's used as a measurement to unlock the TPM and then recover the BitLocker disk encryption key. Obviously, right, the first attack path is let's modify the EFI binaries because it's the first phase, we can change the index table. Unfortunately, the ATMs are deployed with secure boot. So the EFI binaries and the system firmware are digitally signed. There's no attack surface there. But there is a handoff. There's a gap in this initialization process between UEFI and Linux because the phase two process is initialized out of root's profile script. There's a whole Linux initialization process before that. Since we now know the index table that's executed as part of the phase one integrity process, we can map that against the Linux initialization. And if we can find a way to jump in the middle of that, we'll be able to achieve code execution and compromise the platform. So challenge accepted. Let's play cat and mouse. So I'll start off in version 18.x of dynamic security. In version 18.x, the phase one integrity process is contained in bootxsa2. 253 elements are validated. There's a small snippet at the bottom kind of representing what that index table looks like. The Linux architecture is then initialized from system V through several etc init scripts. Root then performs an auto logon, and phase two is triggered out of root's profile. 2,500 files are then calculated. This uses a measurement, unlocks a TPM, etc. The run state of the Linux architecture is pseudo-read-only perspective, which relies on several temporary file systems. The contents of those temporary file systems are then populated from several tar archives. Those archives, unfortunately, are also validated during phase one, so there isn't an attack surface to manipulate those. So this brings us to investigation of the attack surface. All right, we have the index table. We know what the Linux initialization process looks like. Let's look at that full cycle, see what's brought in, and identify if there's any deltas in the phase one integrity validation process, and then how Linux initializes that gives us an opportunity to attack the system. Unfortunately, most of, or just about all of the etc initialization process is validated during phase one, and it looks like they did a pretty good job. But there was one glaring file they overlooked, etc and ATM, which is really funny because that's the script that kicks off the whole thing. So now we have the ability to obtain code execution, but we need to build an environment that allows us to really leverage this. So we need a staging directory that allows us to move files, restore system to acknowledged state that isn't scanned during the initialization process and isn't confirmed. Luckily, in the script that builds some of the summa indexing, they preclude scanning any of their local installation files. And since my goal is system compromise, I thought what better directory to use than Supersheep of Vera, which is supposed to be the AV directory. So to obtain code execution, we take the Etsy initialization process, move that into the staging directory, patch a few global variables, and then inject a proof of concept call within the initialization of X. So I have a small demo, CVE 2023-24064. So inside these demos, I've essentially virtualized the dynamic security architecture via Proxmox. Initially powering on the system, I receive integrity validation error. Okay, shut it down, patch the virtualized disk, and reestablish the Etsy initialization process. Powering back on the ATM, once root performs its auto logon, I'll receive code execution and a callback. All right, well, there we go. So now Linux is compromised. I have full control of the Linux architecture, sitting right in the middle of system initialization. So this is cool and all, but there's still one significant challenge, and that's the fact that the Windows partition, the one that we want to get access to, is still encrypted. Luckily, Supersheep also has an app for that, Mount WinPart. So Mount WinPart takes the BitLocker disk encryption key as a command line argument, decrypts Windows, and performs a third phase of the integrity validation process, looking at a number of files within Windows. So in order to recover that key, I just need to restore the system back to the proper initialization state, resume the integrity validation, and steal the BitLocker disk encryption key. From here, I can decrypt Windows, I can install malware, hook the XFS API, and then obtain the ability to dispense funds from the ATM on demand. System is absolutely compromised. So unfortunately, this vulnerability was observed, or fortunately, I guess, this vulnerability was observed to only impact version 18.x. And at the time of discovery, version 18.x was understood to have been end of life. I identified the vulnerability in December of 21 and confirmed that it was remediated in the next major release of dynamic security. They incidentally had changed to a different versioning scheme, but in version 3.3.0 service release 4, this attack surface was mitigated. It was mitigated by simply validating Etsy init tab during the phase 1 integrity process. Fair enough, that reduces the attack surface. But there's also another interesting change that was made. Specifically, the phase 1 integrity process has been reduced by 20%, going from 253 elements to only 56. And this is important because the phase 1 integrity process is the primary mitigation strategy to prevent compromise against the platform. But the reduction seems like a fairly obvious issue. However, reporting this to Diebold, they designated that this was not a vulnerability, but intentional by design as a feature due to the enhanced security protections provided by IMA. Which led me to, okay, well, what is IMA? It's essentially a secure boot architecture within the run state of Linux, where the Linux kernel and every executable on the system is digitally signed. The digital certificate is then appended to each file as an extended attribute. That attribute contains details about the file name, the directory path, some inode details. You can't just easily manipulate it. Pretty strong security control in concept, but IMA has one glaring issue, and that's the fact that it provides no protections on script interpretation. This is important because we're dealing in a Linux architecture. I have offline access to the Linux disk, and the whole initialization process of Linux is performed through a system shell. That system shell is digitally signed and executed, but anything that it interprets during its execution workflow, for example, your profile script or bash RC, are then executed in the context of that certified binary, paving the path forward for a continued code execution. So let's carry on into service release 9 of 3.3.0. So service release 9, Linux architecture is relatively unchanged, right? Except now we can't use SE in a tab. But taking a closer look into the systemd initialization process, the initialization script mountfs, which builds the temporary architecture, actually has a delete call for etc mtab before it calls to mount. Previously, I had mentioned one of the critical security controls of the architecture is the use of temporary file systems, which require them to read etcfs tab. So if we just move etcfs tab to mtab and link it back, fs tab is deleted before the call to mount is executed, removing the temporary file systems altogether and allowing us to regain persistence to root's home directory. So with that, I have CVE 2023-24063. So again, virtualized system, patch the offline disk, relocate FS tab, power back on the system. When root logs in, we get code execution and receive a callback. Awesome. Linux compromise, total control of the system again. So this time, the attack surface has increased slightly, right? All prior versions of 3.3.0 are known to be vulnerable to this attack surface. I identified the vulnerability in June of 22, and then confirmed remediated essentially the next day as part of service release 10. And in that remediation, etc mtab is no longer deleted. Okay, so I don't have a way to remove fs tab via mtab. Fair enough, but let's continue on with service release 10. So in service release 10, right, init tab is validated, mtab does absolutely nothing, but let's dive a little bit deeper into the mount logic. Mount is a cool command, right? In its default state, though, it has this like nuance where if you attempt to execute mount against a directory path that's previously been mounted, the call to mount will fail and it just won't do anything. Since we're dealing with Linux, what's the default mount point of the whole architecture? The rootfs. So if we just flatten the file system and relocate root var and temp to root and expand the root directory, we're able to, again, regain persistence to root's home directory, patch a profile script, and gain code execution. So with that, I have CVE 2023-24062. So in this demo, we go ahead, we flatten the file system, relocate everything to root, and patch a profile script, powering it up. We'll get code execution and receive our callback. Again, Linux compromise. So this time, the story is starting to change a little bit with the attack surface. This vulnerability was known to impact all prior versions of 3.3.0, 4.0, 4.1, and 4.2. At this point in time, it represents the entire software solution of Dynamic Security. Their whole release train is compromised and vulnerable to this attack surface. The vulnerability was identified in June of 2022, and then confirmed remediated in December as part of Service Release 12. In Service Release 12, they expanded the mountfs initialization script with a delete call to delete root var temp and mount, recreate the directories that remove any persistence that may have been introduced into those directory architectures. All right, well, let's continue diving a little bit deeper into Service Release 12. So service release 12, we're presented with a challenge where I need to remove around a delete call. So, how am I going to deal with that? Well, there's technically still some black magic within mount and how the system's initialized. Specifically, kernel runtime memory that's mounted into user space is done earlier in the system initialization process. And one of the cool things about mounts is they're all based on directory mount points. So you stuff files in that directory, it gets mounted into virtualized space, and then that content's no longer accessible via the physical disk. So if we just take mountfs and stick that in another directory, link to it, validate it during phase 1, but then the file's not accessible, can't be executed, and can't delete our directory structure, allowing us to, again, regain persistence to root's home directory. So here's CVE 2023-28865. So inside this demo, right, relocate mountfs to proc, patch root's profile script, start up the system, and we're able to get code execution and receive a callback.
That's luxury.
All right, well, there we go. Compromised again. Returning to the impacts, we're starting to see a little bit of a trend here. So after the previous patch release, this attack surface now impacts all prior versions of 3.3.0, 4.0, 4.1, and 4.2, again, representing the entire software release of dynamic security. Vulnerability was identified in December of 2022, and then confirmed remediated in February as part of Service Release 15. In Service Release 15, they've now decided to expand the phase 1 integrity process, and they've introduced a number of null sum validations against several critical mount points, essentially to confirm that those directories are empty, certifiable, before the system's even allowed to initialize. All right, cool. Let's carry on with Service Release 15. So at this point, right, in the research, I'm like, man, the mitigation strategy here is complex, right? But what's interesting about that is the more complex the security architecture starts to become, the more likely something is going to be overlooked, right? But in order to kind of figure out those gaps, we need to have a good understanding of like where the boundaries of that security control exist. So creating a directory, a tree of empty directories, right? Those all produce null sums, which is interesting because technically there's still an inode attributed to that. But null sums, right? Directory is totally safe. We create a file, or we symlink to a known file, right? Those create a sum index, and integrity validation fails. We're not able to get the system to power up. But if we create a symlink to a file that doesn't exist, that also calculates a null sum. All right. So we need a new staging directory, right? The goal is to find a staging directory which does not exist in the offline disk, but then is initialized once the Linux kernel boots up. And in order to figure this out, right, I return to the previous attack surface, compromise the platform, and compare the run state of Linux at the point of compromise to what the offline disk looks like. It actually doesn't take very long at all, and I stumble across dev block. Dev block is also like a pretty cool device. I think you see this in a lot of normal Linux distributions, but it's in Dynamics situation, it's actually a link to the raw physical device itself. And it's initialized as part of the Linux kernel. It exists in most all of the versions of Dynamic at this point in time, so it's a really good, persistent opportunity to use. So now I have a directory path, right? Doesn't exist in the offline disk, but exists in the run state of the Linux kernel. So we just need to create a new directory structure. remove var, temp, root to a new path, and then link to those via our transversal shadow directory. Offline disk, null symlinks, we don't get a sum index, system's allowed to initialize, Linux kernel starts up, directory exists, and we're able to get back to our home directory. So here's CVE 2023 33206. So again, we take the offline disk, we move the directory structure around to our transversal point, power back on the system. Once root logs in, we get a code execution and a callback. Cool, yeah, Linux totally compromised again. And again, this vulnerability impacts all prior versions of 3.3.0, 4.0, 4.1, 4.2, and now 4.3. Again, the whole architecture of dynamic security is compromised.
But can you relatively make time? I bet at this point you really have to teach things down.
Yeah, they're just pumping right through. So yeah, the vulnerability, right, identified April of 23, and then confirmed remediated as part of service release 16. So service release 16, now they further expand the phase 1 integrity process and validate symlinks. Broken symlinks now produce an integrity validation error. All right, cool. But they also take another interesting step, and the mountfs mitigation controls are commented out, so they're removed. Doesn't really reintroduce any of the previous attack surfaces because we have null sum validation, there's symlink validation now integrated as part of phase 1. But this is a pretty interesting defense in depth strategy where you remove previous mitigation controls in favor of new implementations. Just interesting. Which conclusion brings me to service release 16. So in service release 16, right, we have symlink validation, there's null sums, there's a lot of structural control around the system initialization process. But the core of that integrity validation is all based on sum indexing. And there's one thing that you can do to a file that has no impact on its sum calculation, and that's the file attributes. Remove execute permissions from a file still calculates the exact same sum. And since the whole architecture of the system is based around IMA, let's just remove execute permissions from that and then gain the ability to execute any unsigned code that we want. So here's CVE 2023 40261. So again, we take the disk, remove execute permissions from IMA, power back on the virtualized system, root logs in, code execution, and a callback. Yeah. All right.
Where are you doing all these systems on top?
I can address that after. I'm almost done. Yeah. So yeah, and then again, taking a look at scope and timeline on this, right? The attack surface again represents the entire software stack of dynamic security. I confirmed, or the vulnerability was identified in July of 23, and then I've been told it's patched as part of service release 17. In addition to that, version 3.3.0 is now end of life as part of December 23. So I guess you're probably asking yourself, right? Oh, I think we need defense, right? So during the course of this talk, right, I've been able to demonstrate a major financial institution platform has an attack surface that allows full compromise of the architecture of the ATM. Not only that, but the attack surface is reciprocal, where their new attacks are likely to have back impact against all previous versions. And even though, yes, the vulnerabilities are patched, the Linux partition is still unencrypted, which increases the likelihood that new vulnerabilities are going to come out. Honestly, it's just a cat and mouse game in relation to that. However, there are several mitigations that can be implemented to reduce the attack surface of the platform. So, of course, as with anything, patch. That's the most appropriate thing to do. Make sure you're running the next major release. In addition to that, directly as a result of this research and the communication with Diebold, in April of 24, they released version 4.4. 4.4 now supports LUKS encryption of the Linux partition, significantly reducing the attack surface against that encrypted architecture. In addition to that, in version 4.0, they introduced a feature, Enable Signature Check. Disabling that feature prevents the BitLocker disk encryption key from being handed off to Mount Wimpart. That also is a significant reduction because it increases the complexity to get that BitLocker key. It's not just handed to you. There's also just the opportunity to replace Dynamic Security's solution with an industry-recognized implementation, not some small European crypto firm. And the several secondary actions, right? Monitor for top hat entry, disable USB ports. The whole architecture of the ATM runs on USB. It's critical to ensure that those devices are certified, you know what's being plugged in. And then, of course, there's no reason hard drives should be easily removable. So those should be locked. The system chassis shouldn't allow removal at all. Yeah, hey, thank you guys for listening to me go on. It's been a pleasure.